If it's Monday, we shall respond. President Biden convenes a meeting in the Situation Room as the administration plans its response to a deadly attack on U.S. service members by Iran-backed militants. Plus, the president says he will shut down the southern border if Congress gives him the authority, as border funding talks on Capitol Hill collide with 2024 politics and record-breaking migration. And new details just in about the framework for a deal to pause the fighting and release more hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, as we're learning more about allegations that a small group of UN workers participated in the October 7th attack. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Gabe Gutierrez in Washington, where the Biden administration is weighing its options and vowing to take action after a deadly attack on American service members. This is the first time U.S. troops have been killed during more than 3 months of assaults by Iran-backed militia groups since the Israel-Hamas war broke out. And it's raising concerns about the potential for a significant escalation in an already tense region. The Defense Department says the drone hit a base along the border of Syria and Jordan called Tower 22, killing 3 U.S. service members and injuring more than 40 others, including 8 who had to be medevaced out of Jordan. The Pentagon says those troops are now in stable condition. And this afternoon, we learned the identities of those 3 U.S. soldiers who were killed. They are Sergeant William Rivers, Specialist Kennedy Sanders, and Specialist Brianna Moffitt. In a statement, President Biden condemned the attack and placed the blame on radical Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq. And he vowed that the U.S. will respond. Moments ago, Secretary of State Antony Blinken renewed President Biden's vow to respond, saying the U.S. would do so at a time and place of its choosing. Earlier today, on his first day back at the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also reacted to the attack.
Let me start with my outrage and sorrow for the death of 3 brave U.S. troops in Jordan and for the other troops who were wounded. The President and I will not tolerate attack on U.S. forces, and we will take all necessary actions to defend the U.S. and our troops.
The president convened a meeting with his national security team in the Situation Room this morning. And during today's White House briefing, National Security Council spokesman John Kirby reiterated that the U.S. is not seeking escalation.
As he said yesterday, we will respond. We'll do that on our schedule, in our time, and we'll do it in the manner of the president's choosing as commander-in-chief. We'll also do it fully cognizant of the fact that these groups, backed by Tehran, have just taken the lives of American troops.
President Biden had been careful to calibrate any retaliation against these attacks from Iranian-backed groups in hopes of deterring a wider regional war. But after yesterday's deadly attack, the president is now facing mounting pressure for a more significant response against Iran and its proxy groups. And joining me now is NBC's Pentagon correspondent Courtney Kube and senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. So, Courtney, I want to start with you. What more do we know about this strike?
So we're learning a little bit more about how this drone may have made its way all the way onto a base, which does have air defense systems. There's a couple of theories that the U.S. is looking at. One is that a U.S. drone was actually coming in, landing, or hovering nearby of the base at the same time, and it may have masked the enemy drone as it was coming in, so the air defense systems could have been confused by that. Officials also say they are looking at the possibility that it was coming in at such a low altitude that that may have played a factor. But it's important to point out that U.S. officials say they still don't know exactly how this drone was able to make its way onto the base. Now, this is a small remote outpost in northeastern Jordan, but it does have some defenses. This drone made its way through. It was packed with explosives, and one of the reasons the casualty count is so high here, Gabe, is because where it exploded was right near where U.S. troops were sleeping at the time. So, as you said, 3 U.S. soldiers now identified as all being soldiers part of an engineering unit out of Georgia. They were killed and at least 40 others injured, including 8 who had to be medevaced to Baghdad, and 3 of those individuals went on to Landstuhl for further treatment. So a serious attack here. And the big question now is who was responsible and how does the U.S. respond? And you played several different sound bites there from White House officials, including President Biden, saying that they will respond to this. Well, officials here say they are still working through final attribution, but they are pointing to some of the hallmarks or fingerprints of a group called Kataib Hezbollah. They operate in Iraq and Syria. They've been responsible for many of the 160 other attacks on bases with Americans over the last 3 months. But the big key here is they are funded, trained, and equipped by Iran. And we heard from the Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary today, Sabrina Singh. She said that while they don't have indications that this attack was directed by Iran, it does have Iran's fingerprints on it. So U.S. officials say that they are looking through potential options here. And that includes, remember, we have seen the U.S. respond to attacks in the past when there have been American service members injured. But they are looking at a very wide range of potential response options here, Gabe.
Yeah, and I know, Courtney, that you have been to the region before, so we thank you for that perspective. The Pentagon spokesperson also saying that Iran bears responsibility for this attack, although, as you said, they have not said that Iran was directly ordering it. But I want to go now to Kelly O'Donnell at the White House. And Kelly, what more do we know about the meeting in the Situation Room today? How is the president weighing his options here?
Well, part of the challenge right now is really following what Courtney said, and that is that the U.S. military is still in the process of defining as best it can who is responsible. And then that, of course, means the options presented to the president cover a range of things. So he has now had 2 meetings where he is working with his national security team to consider options. And the president has to look at not only how to respond to those who were most directly involved, what are the repercussions of that response, and what are the implications for other issues that are currently at play, which, of course, includes the U.S. and its position on the Hamas-Israel war, concern about hostages, including some Americans who are still in Gaza. All of these different complexities are a part of what the president has to consider. They've talked about the fact that the U.S. can control the timeline. That is in part for things like evaluating the options, assigning the, as Courtney called it, the attribution, the blame, who was responsible for this, and then trying to pick a time where there is strategic benefit to the U.S. to strike. When I asked John Kirby, the spokesperson for the National Security Council today in the briefing, would this be the kind of a response that is plainly known to the public? The U.S. has many different options. Some can be pronounced strikes where there is clear military action, and at other times there can be other ways that they use their authorities, powers, and capabilities that are not so visible to the public. And in this case, John Kirby says you'll know when this happens. So in our discussion of this and in the reaction to the fact that this is jarring, terrible news, there is sort of an urgency that something must happen quickly. That may not be the case based on conditions on the ground, the info coming to the president, and his decision process in this. It is very complex, and it is also something where, because Iran has been warned and these instances of provocation and now lethal acts have taken place, consideration for what could be next steps when the U.S. is saying they do not want to provoke a wider conflict or direct conflict with Iran. Gabe?
Yeah, and Kelly, a lot of options here, as you said, perhaps a cyber attack. And notably, John Kirby today did not rule out a potential strike inside Iran, but there's a lot of political pressure here right now. Kelly, tell me a little bit more about that. What type of political pressure is the president under right now?
There's considerable pressure, everything from questions about does he have the authority to act without seeking explicit approval from Congress. The U.S., the administration here says yes, under the U.S. Constitution, he does have that authority. Also questions about the impact on the international cries for a ceasefire in Gaza. That has not been the U.S. position, other than a support for a pause to allow for humanitarian aid and hostages and to allow Israel to act. So there are all these different centers of political pressure, many of them coming from, at times, office holders or people who are political actors. But only the president has the ultimate responsibility to make these decisions with his national security team. And so the White House pushed back very forcefully today that overt political considerations are not a part of what the president has to review. Yes, we are in a political environment, but the decisions the commander-in-chief needs to make are really based on the focused set of facts in front of him and not necessarily in response to all of these other issues. Gabe?
Kelly O'Donnell at the White House, Courtney Kube at the Pentagon. Thank you both so much. And let me now bring in retired General David Petraeus, former commander of U.S. Central Command and former director, of course, of the CIA. Now, General, you've been inside the room during situations like this. What kind of conversations are happening at the White House and the Pentagon right now?
Well, there's the big question of attribution, Gabe, as was mentioned. And until that's crystal clear and you're certain about that, obviously, laying out various options is difficult. I'm sure that the Pentagon and Central Command are combining to identify a set of options. If it's this particular group that is pinpointed, say Kataib Hezbollah, which we also know well from our time in Iraq, needless to say, or if it is perhaps another group, then what is the relationship with the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force? What role did they play in this, if there is one identified? And then, of course, what are the objectives that we're seeking to achieve? In addition to sending a message that this is completely unacceptable, it shouldn't be done again, do we want to degrade and to reduce the capacity of this particular group? And do you consider going directly to the source of the trouble here, which is, of course, Iran, which through the Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force funds, trains, equips, and in many cases directs the Shia militia in Iraq and Syria, but also, of course, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, who are disrupting freedom of navigation in the Red Sea. I can't recall, Gabe, any time since 1979 when we carried out an overt airstrike inside Iran. Now, it may be that there have been some, but I just don't recall any since the aborted operation to try to rescue our hostages in Tehran. In Desert One, it got no farther. So that's what they're discussing very intensively. Of course, the action officers and so forth are in probably nonstop Zooms back and forth with Central Command, the headquarters in Tampa, the forward headquarters in Doha, outside Doha, Qatar, and then, of course, the commander on the ground in that particular region in Iraq, in Syria as well.
General, look, certainly any strike inside Iran would be hugely significant. And you mentioned some other options being considered. What are they? Because earlier this month, I asked President Biden whether the airstrikes at the time in Yemen, were they working? And he acknowledged that they weren't as a deterrent. So the question is, what other options does he have? What do you think are some of those options being considered right now?
First of all, if I could, when it comes to Yemen, I think the objective, there's a recognition that it's unlikely that they can force the Houthis to stop their operations. This is the Houthis' moment to be somebody in the neighborhood. You know, they were an insignificant element until now. This is their Saladin moment. You know, they're fighting the Crusaders kind of issue. What you can do, and what we have done, I firmly believe, is degrade their ability to continue the attacks, reduce their capacity, destroy some of the stockpiles, the radars, the launch facilities, and so forth. And if you think about that, then in the context of this response, how could you degrade? How could you reduce the capacity and the capability of these forces? Do you go after the leaders and their command and control? Where are the stockpiles? Where are the IRGC, Quds Force training bases, and so forth? And perhaps we go after all of those because, look, the loss of 3 soldiers is very, very significant. We've been incredibly fortunate so far because of quite good defenses to fend off all these attacks and had not lost a soldier until now, although dozens have been wounded. So this is a very significant blow, and it's going to require a very significant response, far more than a cyber attack, although there may be some non-visible actions taken as well, and perhaps something even in the covert action realm. But I think this will require multiple substantial kinetic strikes. And the big question is, do you confine them just to Syria and perhaps to Iraq, keeping in mind that the Iraq-U.S. relationship is quite fragile now? We've just started negotiations on the future presence of forces there, which the government, I think, would like to keep us there, the Iraqi government and the U.S. government, to keep an eye and pressure on the Islamic State, a Sunni extremist organization, but the Shia militias are trying to force us out to do Iran's bidding, which has always been one of their objectives, is to get us out of the region.
Yeah, General, with the death of those service members, this attack definitely feels different. But I want to ask you about Iran's role in all this. The White House has consistently said that Iran bears responsibility here because it funds these groups. But U.S. officials had previously assessed that Iran itself, that the supreme leader, did not want a wider war. What do you think about that? And how much control does Iran really have over these proxy groups?
Well, I think Iran is happy, frankly, to fight to the last Houthi, the last Hezbollah fighter, the last Hamas terrorist, and the last Iraqi Shia militia, as long as it doesn't get out of control and threaten their number one objective in life, which is, of course, to preserve their position in Iran, to preserve their power. They don't want, for example, I don't believe, to see freedom of navigation disrupted out of the Gulf, because they send 1.8 million barrels of crude oil out per day, in addition to all the other oil and natural gas that comes from the Gulf states. They don't want to get into a direct fight with the U.S. because they'll be on the losing end. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, we don't want to get into that either, because we have a lot of vulnerabilities in the region. We have a lot of U.S. citizens there, a lot of interest there. And our bases are more vulnerable to the increasing range, accuracy, and capabilities of the Iranian missile and drone fleet. So in that sense, exactly right. They don't want a wider war like that. But again, they're happy to see some of these other actions, I think, to put pressure on us, noting that, these groups don't necessarily always respond to everything that comes out of Tehran. And in fact, it's known, as an example, that Hamas apparently did not share the timing of this operation with them, and that Tehran was surprised by 10/7.
General David Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. And coming up, troubling allegations that some employees of a UN agency providing humanitarian aid in Gaza participated in the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. The details, the fallout, and the U.S. response ahead. Plus, nearly 250,000 migrants crossed the southern border illegally last month as some lawmakers worked to cut a deal on border security and others worked to squash it. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Stay with us. And welcome back. Turning now to Capitol Hill, where politics are colliding with a potential deal to address the crisis at the southern border. The influx of migrants hit a record in December, according to Customs and Border Protection, with CBP reporting a 30% increase in illegal crossings between November and December. That comes as Senate negotiators are reportedly close on a bipartisan deal to address the issue. President Biden has thrown his support behind the effort, pledging to use any authority granted to him in the bill.
If that bill were the law today, I'd shut down the border right now and fix it quickly. A bipartisan bill would be good for America and help fix our broken immigration system and allow speedy access for those who deserve to be here.
President Biden's likely 2024 opponent, former President Donald Trump, is making no secret of the fact that he wants Republicans to block the deal, as Trump looks to make the border crisis a key part of his campaign against Biden. But that plan isn't sitting too well with one of the deal's lead negotiators, Republican Senator James Lankford.
Republicans 4 months ago would not give funding for Ukraine, for Israel, and for our southern border because we demanded changes in policy. So we actually locked arms together and said, we're not going to give you money for this. We want a change in law. And now it's interesting, a few months later, when we're finally getting to the end, they're like, oh, just kidding. I actually don't want a change in law because it's a presidential election year. We all have an oath to the Constitution, and we have a commitment to say we're going to do whatever we can to be able to secure the border.
And on top of it all, yesterday, House Republicans unveiled articles of impeachment against the official in charge of the border, DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And joining me now here on set is NBC's Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, and Ryan Nobles joins us from Capitol Hill. Julia, I want to start with you. A lot going on your beat right now.
Yeah.
We mentioned the border numbers at the start of this segment. Walk us through that. How significant was it, that increase from November to December? And what are you hearing about the numbers this month?
It was incredibly significant in December. I was down there, Gabe. I know you spent a lot of time down there, too. It was really unlike anything I'd seen before. Hundreds coming through, thousands in a day in single areas like Eagle Pass, Texas, Lukeville, Arizona, some really remote places that haven't been historically well staffed by Border Patrol. I think that was the impetus to get the Biden administration where they are now, but they fell really significantly in January. They're down 50% from where they were in December, so I don't think January will be another record high. Of course, seasonally, they do pick back up in the spring, but one of the reasons why they were so high in December and fell so low in January is because Mexico started picking up more migrants and interdicting them on their way, and they also started deporting migrants back to Venezuela, something previously not done.
Yeah, and the White House has been saying that, right? That enforcement by Mexico has contributed to this. How real is that, though?
It is real, but their funding can run out, so the U.S. would like more funding to send to Mexico to keep doing that. And, of course, as these numbers increase and as that seasonal surge comes, it all comes down to the numbers. When you outnumber the people who are in the field in Mexico or the United States, they can't process them quickly enough, more people end up being released. And if you're more likely to be released, you're more likely to tell someone else, a relative, they can make the journey too.
And Julia, give us a reality check here. Over the last couple of days, we've heard President Biden talk about shutting down the border. Republicans, meanwhile, say that he already has the authority to do it. The White House coming back and saying that, Republicans back during the Trump administration were saying that it was up to Congress. So where does that stand? Does President Biden actually have the authority to, quote, shut down the border?
I think it's the idea of how we define that. I think what they're talking about is trigger points, where if the numbers got up to a certain point a day, he would, quote, shut down the border. But when I talk to people who would be responsible for that, they say it really comes back to how many people Mexico will take back. And they're pointing to the last closest thing we have to this, which was under Title 42 during COVID. We blocked, the Trump administration blocked any asylum seekers from crossing. Biden administration made a special carve out for children. But it didn't work because, again, they've got to be outnumbered, because when Mexico refuses to take back more migrants than they can handle, they simply pile up, they're released in the United States, and more people come. So if it didn't work then, it's hard to see how it'd work now, especially as more people keep coming.
Shutting down the border, a lot easier said than done. Julia Ainsley, thanks. Stay with us. I want to turn now to Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill. Ryan, a border deal looks like it's on the horizon. So what's the latest on timing, and how much do we know about what that bill would include?
So the Senate negotiators have said that they plan to release the legislative text sometime early this week. So we imagine maybe tomorrow or Wednesday. The Senate isn't in session today. And we do know at least a little bit about the contours of the bill itself. We know that it's going to address asylum and the process of people applying for asylum, and then the amount of time they would spend in the asylum system, reducing it to months as opposed to years. And then also it would change the way the parole system works within the migration process, and would allow for a stricter interpretation of parole and when people would be released from that system. So that's just two aspects of the broader bill, which negotiators are working out right now. But to Julia's point, there would be certain triggers associated with it that would allow them to take some more forceful action in terms of letting people in or out of the country. And that's part of what Republicans have been contending with, that they're unhappy with. But what's interesting, Gabe, is that there's a lot in this bill we just do not know about yet, because the full text has not been released. And while we're getting little bits and pieces of what the negotiators have said they're focused on, until we actually see the details in the bill written in plain language that people can respond to, it's really difficult to forecast whether or not it has a chance of getting 60 votes in the Senate, and then whether or not it has any shot of even making it to the floor of the House of Representatives, which right now seems unlikely.
And Ryan, as we wait for that text to be released, talk to me about the articles of impeachment against Secretary Mayorkas. What are House Republicans arguing here, and do they have the numbers for a vote?
Yeah, and it really complicates these negotiations too, Gabe, because Alejandro Mayorkas is one of the people in the room during these negotiations. We see him up here on Capitol Hill meeting with the negotiators on a regular basis. Basically, what House Republicans are accusing Mayorkas of is not following the law, not using the tools in place under statute to try and keep the border under control. And they say that he's doing it willfully, that essentially doing it on purpose to allow more migrants into the country than what the law allows. Now, Democrats have flat flatly rejected that. They say that this is just a political tool. It's a way to use Mayorkas as a cudgel in an election year to suggest that the administration is failing as it relates to the border crisis. And it's also important to point out, Gabe, that this is not going to go anywhere beyond the House. If they do have the votes to impeach him, and that still isn't a guarantee, it would require 2/3 of the Senate in order to convict him of anything and also to throw him out of office. That is very unlikely, especially given the fact that Democrats control the Senate. And in many ways, it's forced President Biden into a situation where he's actually supporting Alejandro Mayorkas more, defending him because he's become a symbol of his administration's policies. So, the Republicans have been successful in using this as a political weapon. Whether or not it has a practical impact that they're promising their voters seems unlikely.
And Ryan, before I let you go really quickly, we also learned today that the office of the Sergeant at Arms has been subpoenaed. What more do we know about that?
Not a whole lot, Gabe. This came as a surprise to many. The House clerk read the details of this subpoena request on the House floor not too long ago. We've reached out to the Speaker's office and the Sergeant at Arms office to try and get some understanding as what it's related to, and have been told that the contents are not available for public information. So this is a curious situation of which we're still trying to figure out exactly what the whole situation is related to.
A mysterious subpoena. Ryan Nobles, I know you'll stay on it. Ryan Nobles on Capitol Hill, Julia Ainsley here with me. Thank you both so much. And up next, immigration politics are playing a key role in the upcoming congressional race in New York that's far from the border, as House Republicans cling to a razor-thin majority. Can Democrats flip the seat formerly held by expelled Republican Congressman George Santos? You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. The record-breaking influx of migrants has become a key campaign issue in a special election that threatens to shrink Speaker Mike Johnson's already razor-thin majority in the House. In an attempt to hang on to New York's 3rd congressional district after George Santos's expulsion, Republicans are hitting the airwaves, focusing on the border. Take a listen.
Tom Suozzi rolled out the red carpet for illegal immigrants. Suozzi helped create our immigration crisis.
I kicked ICE out of Nassau County.
And he'll make it worse. Illegal immigrants arriving by the busload. Why? Because Tom Suozzi repeatedly weakened America's borders. Suozzi supported allowing illegal immigrants charged with violent crimes to be released back into our community.
The Democrat in that race, former Congressman Tom Suozzi, is pushing back on those attacks with ads of his own.
The southern border is 2,000 miles away, but the migrant crisis has landed right in our own backyard. I'll work across the aisle to do what our leaders haven't, secure our border.
You've been hearing a lot of nonsense blaming Tom Suozzi for the migrant problem. Really? Tom Suozzi will work with both parties to close illegal immigration routes, but open paths to citizenship for those who follow the rules.
And anything else you might hear is garbage.
And joining me now here on set is Amy Walter, publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report. Amy, thanks so much for joining us.
Look, glad to be here.
What an interesting race here in Long Island. You know, it's no surprise that Republicans are talking up the issue of immigration, but the Democrat, Tom Suozzi, is also coming out with ads of his own. What does that say about the impact of this issue?
Yeah, that it is happening as an issue all over the country, especially here in Long Island, because, you know, when you're in Long Island, you're not that far from the city of New York, where there is a migrant crisis, where the mayor himself has called out the administration.
Yeah, and though in Long Island, migrants haven't been bused there, but it is part of that.
But it's part
market.
of the, exactly,
right.
That you're in that media market in the same way that the issue of crime was used really effectively by Republicans in New York State in the last election, right? Looking at the crime that was happening, especially in and around New York City, and saying this is the result of policies of Democrats, right? Especially the governor, Kathy Hochul. That was really, really effective. And so what we're seeing in this contest here is, yes, a Democrat who's trying to go on offense right now, knowing that it's going to be a hot topic, trying to show that he's on the right side of this issue. I thought it was really interesting, too, that he talks about border security over here, but also immigration as looking for a pathway and looking for ways to compromise, which, when we go back to your last conversation, it looks as if House Republicans are not particularly interested in compromise.
And that was going to be my next question. How does any potential deal on border security funding over the next couple of days or weeks, how does that factor into this? This election is on February 13th.
That's right.
How does, what happens if there is a deal, although right now it's looking like Mike Johnson doesn't want it?
It doesn't look that way. I mean, I still think they will be fighting about what his policies and his positions were when he was in Congress and when he was running for governor. What's also interesting, we will have abortion also in this debate. The Democrats who are supporting Suozzi up with ads accusing the Republican of being part of the MAGA majority, being too restrictive on abortion. So abortion and immigration, two issues we know are going to be hot topics in 2024, get their sort of debut in a special election in February.
That is incredibly interesting with both parties focusing on each of those issues. For Democrats, though, what do you think will happen here in terms of turnout? Will the abortion issue really affect turnout in this race?
That's what they're hoping. And I just talked to folks last week about this, that it will help to generate enthusiasm. Now, New York, notably, the issue of abortion didn't generate enough enthusiasm in that state in 2022, like it did in places like Michigan, where there was an actual ballot initiative. You saw turnout really go up in a state like New York or some of these other blue states like California, Oregon, where voters didn't really feel like abortion was at stake because they think, well, I'm in a blue state, this doesn't really apply to us. You didn't see that really strong turnout from Democrats. So we will see whether now that the issue is still being discussed, and we obviously are going to have another court decision on the abortion medication, that the issue is still front and center.
A lot to watch there. And before I let you go, though, what does this mean for Speaker Mike Johnson's razor-thin majority? If the Democrat wins here, it goes down to 2 seats?
That's right.
And then if Steve Scalise remains hospitalized because of cancer, is sidelined because of cancer treatments, it goes down to 1. How significant is this race for that House majority?
I think it's going to tell us a lot more about not just what the majority is now, but what it could look like in 2024. This is a district that Democrats need to win in the sense that it's a Biden district. Biden won this district by 8. These are the kind of districts Democrats say, we can win these. We only need to win 5 districts like these. We get the majority back. But if they don't win there in this February, they're going to have a hard time making the case in November. Totally different elections. One's a special, one's in November, but still, the optics won't be great.
Amy Walter, thanks so much for joining us and speaking to us about this key race to watch early on in this cycle. Amy, thanks. And after the break, setting the stakes, Nikki Haley tells Meet the Press what she needs out of South Carolina to keep her campaign against former President Trump alive. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Turning to the Republican presidential primary, where Nikki Haley says she is planning to stay in the race through Super Tuesday in early March. It comes after she lost to former President Trump in Iowa by 31 points and lost in New Hampshire by double digits, prompting the RNC to call on her to drop out. Now she heads to her home state of South Carolina, where polls show she also trails Trump. And here is what she told Kristen Welker on Meet the Press yesterday.
Do you need to win your home state in order to stay in this race? Is it do or die?
I think I need to do better than I did in New Hampshire. So this is a building situation. What I do think I need to do is I need to show that I'm building momentum. I need to show that I'm stronger in South Carolina than New Hampshire. Does that have to be a win? I don't think that necessarily has to be a win, but it certainly has to be better than what I did in New Hampshire, and it certainly has to be close.
And joining me now on set is Tia Mitchell, the Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Levin, former Democratic congressman from Michigan, who is a distinguished fellow at the Center for American Progress, and Stephen Hayes, editor and CEO of The Dispatch, who is also an NBC News political analyst. Thanks so much for joining us here on Meet the Press Now. So, Tia, I want to start with you. You just heard Nikki Haley talking there about what she needs to do in South Carolina, essentially clear 44%. Is that realistic?
Well, the current polling shows her at less than 44% right now. So it's like almost the best case scenario is doing about as well as she did in New Hampshire, if not a little bit worse. But I think at this point, because she's decided to forge through, it does make sense for her to say, I'm in it till Super Tuesday, because there wasn't good news for her in South Carolina, let alone Nevada, which she's not paying attention to at all. There wasn't any good news for her going into these contests, so she might as well continue to look past them.
But Stephen, turning to you, how can she credibly make that argument? She loses in Iowa, she loses in New Hampshire, she loses her home state in South Carolina. Of course, polling shows that she's well behind there. Should she stay in for Super Tuesday?
She can't credibly make that argument, to be blunt about it. If she loses, New Hampshire was arguably the single best state in the union for Nikki Haley, and she came in 11 points behind. South Carolina, her home state, as Tia points out, Donald Trump has a big lead there. We haven't yet seen polling about a two-person race, so I think that the Haley people are hopeful that she'll show a bump and she can capitalize on, make the case that now this is a two-person race. And the Republican electorate, that's not part of the primary base, that's not the hardcore MAGA Trump base of the Republican Party, is gettable, I think, for her. I think she's late to be making the case to them at this point, but I think their bargain is, we'll make this case to the broader Republican Party. We will make an argument that nobody wants this Joe Biden-Donald Trump race and that Nikki Haley is the thing standing in the way.
And I want to play something that Nikki Haley told Kristen Welker yesterday about former President Trump's legal troubles, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
What is unique about this case is that the jury has now ruled. They have found him liable of sexual abuse. Do you not trust the jury and their findings, Ambassador?
I absolutely trust the jury, and I think that they made their decision based on the evidence. I just don't think that should take him off the ballot. I think the American people will take him off the ballot. I think that's the best way to go forward, is not let him play the victim, let him play the loser. That's what we want him to do at the end of the day.
And Andy, this seems just a little bit further than most Republicans are willing to go. What do you make of that answer?
How is she going to break through? I mean, you all didn't even mention Nevada, which is happening. She's not even there, right? I mean, the Republican Party essentially is imploding. MAGA-ism, Trump and his movement have caused the Republican Party to lose the House in 2018, to lose the Congress and the presidency in 2020. They barely got the House back, and what was supposed to be a big year for them in 2022, not to mention governorships and state Supreme Court races. It's been a disaster, and now this guy with dozens and dozens of indictments and civil charges against him is their standard bearer. And what used to be a Republican in my, during most of my adult lifetime, they're horrified by this person being the standard bearer of their party.
And Tia, Nikki Haley is still running, or at least said she's running, on this issue of electability. Hasn't that ship sailed?
Well, because to Representative Levin's point, the people who are horrified, who say they're horrified for Donald Trump, are still indicating they'll support him if he's their nominee. They're not completely, there are some of the never Trumpers who've completely turned away from him, but a lot of them, including Nikki Haley, have turned away somewhat, but not completely. She hadn't said she wouldn't support him in a general election against Joe Biden, for example. So for her, the electability argument, to me, it can only go so far when you're willing to say, hey, I don't think the guy should be president. I think I'm better than him, but his main rival, Joe Biden, he's still better than him, So, and again, she has pulled punches until recently. She started to go harder recently, but for a long time in this Republican presidential primary, they were going after Joe Biden much more than they were trying to make the electability argument about Trump, even as he faced all these charges. So it's a tone, it's a posture that she didn't make, I think, clear enough earlier in the contest.
And Stephen, I want to turn now to the border politics in Congress. Here is what Donald Trump said over the weekend.
As the leader of our party, there is zero chance I will support this horrible open borders betrayal of America. It's not going to happen. A lot of the senators are trying to say respectfully they're blaming it on me. I said, that's okay. Please blame it on me. Please. Because they were getting ready to pass a very bad bill. And I'll tell you what, a bad bill is, I'd rather have no bill than a bad bill.
Please blame me. He's essentially injecting himself into these negotiations. What is a congressional Republican to do?
Well, naively, I would say a congressional Republican should vote how he or she feels would be the best policy. But I guess that's a long time ago, right? Maybe that's not applicable today. Look, I think the Biden administration deserves a ton of blame for creating what is a catastrophic situation on the border. It was bad before. It's gotten worse. I think it's gotten worse largely because of policy choices. Totally fair for Republicans to criticize the Biden administration for the negligence and mismanagement of the border. Having said that,
a couple years ago, Democrats would never have gone this far, though.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. They wouldn't have gone this far, but they're going this far because they're in a bad spot politically when you've got Democratic mayors of major cities blaming the Biden administration out loud, openly, for their mismanagement of the policy. I think the Biden administration deserves a ton of blame for the policy mistakes. It's because you're seeing Democrats on the back foot on this issue that Republicans are saying, hey, we don't want to solve the issue. We want the issue to run on. We don't want to solve the problem. And I think that's disgraceful.
And what do you make of the discussion, Andy, that I was having with Julia Ainsley earlier? President Biden saying that, if he gets this bill, he would shut down the border. Republicans coming back and saying you should shut the border down right now. What do you make of that argument?
I mean, I think what you were saying earlier is really true, Gabe. Democrats are willing to go farther than they have on this because we're seeing this huge surge of immigrants. It's not really a Republican or a Democratic issue. The world is changing, and it's very hard for us to deal with. We ought to work on it together. President Biden is ready to solve the problem together with Republicans. And here the Republican leading candidate for president is out there saying, don't do anything, because I want to win politically. I don't care if people suffer.
And Andy, you're from Michigan. I want to turn now to this 2024 election. And Biden facing a lot of opposition from his left, progressives in Michigan over the conflict in the Middle East. A lot of Arab American voters there saying they do not support what the president is doing. And then also progressives on the immigration issue. How should Democrats and the Biden administration respond to that?
Gabe, this isn't really just progressives. You've got over 1,000 black pastors from around the country. Muslim Americans aren't all progressives. Arab Americans aren't all progressives. Young people, they all are saying to President Biden, we can't stand this carnage. We can't stand 2,000-pound bombs that Israel gets from us being dropped on a population of 2.2 million people, I guess, to, penetrate tunnels underneath. We need the president really needs to change course here and push for a ceasefire and get a political solution to this problem. One thing we know for sure, there is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Tia, I want to end with you, keeping on that issue of the Middle East. Over the weekend, we heard, Donald Trump and Nikki Haley call Biden weak, but, Nikki Haley going further than Donald Trump. He just says that, under his administration, this wouldn't have happened. How does President Biden deal with this moving forward?
I think President Biden's in a tough spot now. There were just 3 service members killed in the Middle East. All 3 were actually from Georgia. And so there's a lot of pressure now that says this is going on President Biden. It falls under his watch, and it's because of his policies. But he's now trying to please everyone. And we know that's an impossible spot presidents are often put in, but now he's got to figure out how to thread the needle.
Tia, thank you so much. And Andy and Stephen, thanks so much for joining us as well. We really appreciate it. And still to come, new details on a framework deal that's being presented to Hamas today to pause the fighting and get the remaining hostages out. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. As we noted, we're monitoring developments out of the Middle East, where talks over a potential ceasefire in the Israel-Hamas war are ongoing. A source familiar with those talks tells NBC News that negotiators from the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar are presenting Hamas with the framework for a 60-day pause in fighting that would include the release of hostages being held in Gaza. And there are also new developments today surrounding allegations that UN workers took part in the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. NBC News has obtained 2 Israeli security dossiers that allege at least 12 members of the staff at the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, took part in that October 7th terrorist attack on Israel and the subsequent kidnappings. NBC News has not independently verified Israel's claims. The U.S. is among a growing list of countries suspending aid to UNRWA while these allegations are investigated. UNRWA has condemned the October 7th attack, but it warns that it may not be able to continue providing life-saving aid in Gaza without additional funding. NBC News foreign correspondent Raf Sanchez joins me now from Tel Aviv, and with me here in studio is Chief Washington correspondent and Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, thanks. I want to start with you. What else is in the framework of this deal?
Well, Secretary Blinken at a news conference just now was asked about the framework that we had reported on, and he said it is strong and compelling, a strong and compelling proposal. So the U.S. is behind it. Egypt is now presenting it to Hamas today. Hamas, of course, has the final word here. The three Israeli spy leaders, Shin Bet and Mossad, were in Paris for these talks with the Qatari Prime Minister, the Egyptian intelligence, and Bill Burns from the CIA. And I just interviewed the Qatari Prime Minister, who said that they hope that Hamas will agree to it.
Did he seem optimistic that Hamas would agree to it?
He said he's hopeful. But let me tell you what's in it, because this would be, extraordinary. It's all of the prisoners, all of the hostages to be released for all of the Palestinian prisoners. Now, there are thousands of Palestinian prisoners. The first phase would be a 60-day humanitarian halt in all the fighting. The aid would go in, all the civilian hostages would get out, as well as a 3-for-1 exchange with Palestinian prisoners, and a redeployment as yet not defined of the IDF, especially from Khan Yunis. The second phase, though, would be the release of, and it would be women first and the civilians. The second phase would be the women IDF soldiers as well as the male IDF soldiers for all of the Palestinian prisoners. There are as many as 7,000 of them, as well as more aid going in.
A 60-day pause in fighting. It's just incredible if it does come together. Thank you for that strong reporting, Andrea. But I want to turn now to Raf Sanchez. He's in Israel. And Raf, I want to get a reaction from you on these allegations against those UNRWA workers and the U.S. pausing funding for that agency. What's been the reaction in Israel to that?
Well, the Israelis have had a problem with UNRWA for a long time, Gabe. They say that UNRWA is perpetuating what they see as the Palestinian myth of refugees who might one day return to what is modern-day Israel, what the Palestinians call the right of return. They say is a core right. They also say that UNRWA is, in the words of Prime Minister Netanyahu, riddled in Gaza with employees who are moonlighting as Hamas operatives. And in this dossier that we obtained earlier, some of these allegations relating to October 7th are laid out. We should be really clear these are the allegations. The evidence behind them is not included in this dossier, but the allegations are being taken seriously enough by the United States and other countries that they are pausing funding in the middle of this humanitarian crisis. I'll give you just one example of the allegations, Gabe. They are saying that an UNRWA school counselor crossed over into Israel on October 7th, and along with his son, he kidnapped a female hostage. Now, again, NBC News has not been able to independently verify that. Gabe.
And Raf, without that funding, do Palestinians have sources for aid at this point?
So there are other humanitarian organizations operating inside of Gaza, but the UN and UNRWA are really the absolute backbone of humanitarian aid distribution inside of Gaza. It is UNRWA schools that Palestinians are sheltering in. It is UNRWA food and medicine distribution points that most of those nearly 2 million displaced Palestinians in Gaza are getting what little aid they can from. So the international community has really used UNRWA as its method of delivery throughout this crisis.
And Andrea, before I let you go, does Hamas have more leverage than Israel right now in these hostage talks?
They do, because while Israel is a divided coalition government, there is a lot of pressure to get the hostages out. And if they would agree to a pause under these terms where any breach would be monitored by, an international group, that might be very, much of an incentive to the hardliners or to Netanyahu to overlook the hardliners, if he could, in this coalition. The problem is that Hamas has consistently called for a permanent, immediate ceasefire, and this is a phased ceasefire with the releases along the way. And as the U.S. has been saying, they get a veto.
And finally, with the timeline for this, you said this is being presented to Hamas. Any indication when we might hear?
It's being presented as we speak in Egypt. They started talking to the Egyptians, presented it to Hamas on the Egyptian side of the border.
Yeah.
And at any time we could hear.
We shall see. Our Chief Foreign
Thank you,
Affairs
Gabe.
correspondent
Good to be with
Andrea
you.
Mitchell is here with that new reporting. Ralph Sanchez for us in Tel Aviv. Thank you both so much. And thank you for being with us this hour. I'm Gabe Gutierrez, and I'll be back here tomorrow for more Meet the Press Now. The news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.